Hello students, welcome to video 2.1, the scientific method and measures of central tendency. This corresponds to information that can be found in your book in sections 1.6 and 1.13 through 1.15. So this unit is all about the scientific aspects of psychological research. In class, we discussed reasons why we needed to do formal research in psychology, mainly because of those biases. In psychological research, we want to make sure that we're being as objective as possible and measuring and seeing what we're actually seeing. In order to make sure that we're doing that, psychologists follow the scientific method. I'm sure you've seen this in one or another science classes, but we're going to go through this again for your reference. The scientific method is as follows. First, we will ask a question or address a problem. Psychologists will notice a certain phenomena that they would like to study or explain more thoroughly. For instance, you notice that the students that are more distracted in class perform less well on assessments than students who are able to focus and take notes. Then they will move on to conduct research to see if anyone has addressed that phenomena before. So they will see if someone has already done research on that, or if there are studies that could help inform how to conduct an experiment on this. Next, they will form a hypothesis or an educated guess on what they believe is going to happen. And then they will do some type of study or experiment to test their hypothesis. After that experiment, they will move on and analyze the results to see if they need to go back and retest their hypothesis or if their hypothesis was correct. Then they'll move on to their conclusions and see what they can say overall about the behavior and what their results of their study is. So that was just a general overview. Now we're going to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into each one of these steps. So the first step is perceiving a question or a problem. This is when researchers will notice a certain thing happening and they'll try to find an explanation for it. This step comes out of the first of the 4 goals of psychology, which is trying to describe what's going on. They will notice something and they'll try to figure out what is happening in that situation. So once again, you observe a behavior that you want to study, and then you come up with a question about that behavior. Now that you've got the behavior you want to study, psychologists will do some preliminary research to make sure that either no one has studied it yet, or to find research that will help support their hypothesis so you have a reason to study it. Again, this step is to make sure that somebody hasn't already studied what you're trying to explain, or to help you get ideas on how to go about studying the behavior that you have just noticed. And now that you've done some preliminary research, you go on and you create a hypothesis. You come up with an educated guess that tries to explain what is going on in the behavior that you're observing. You try to come up with reasons why the behavior is happening, or things that lead to that behavior or that phenomenon. When you do this, you have to be sure that you state your hypothesis in a way that makes it testable. Going back to that earlier example of students doing better in class when they pay more attention, if I wanted to come up with a hypothesis, I would say either students who are distracted more often in class perform worse on assessments, or students who pay more attention in class tend to do better on assessments. That way, phrasing it like that makes sure that I can now go and test my hypothesis. Transitioning into this next step, testing your hypothesis, is where we can encounter one of those kinds of biases that limit the reliability of research. This is where we can run into the confirmation bias, or the tendency to only see things that confirm our beliefs, and the tendency to ignore things that contradict our beliefs. So when we're testing our hypothesis, we want to be sure that we look at the data as a whole and not just pay attention to the things that confirm our hypothesis and ignore things that go against our hypothesis. Depending on your hypothesis, there are different research methods that you can go through to get the answer that you're looking for. And we will study each of those methods in detail during this unit. An example of some of the research methods that psychologists use are surveys, naturalistic observations, going out to people's environments and just observing their behavior, or experiments, trying to manipulate certain variables to see what results. Again, we're going to go more in depth into each of the research methods that psychologists use, but making sure that we know that objectively testing our hypothesis is a major part of psychology and psychological research. This step in the scientific method fully addresses psychology's second goal, which is trying to get an explanation of behavior. So first, we want to describe the behavior, and we have done that in our first step. And now, in this step, through testing our hypothesis, we want to explain the behavior. What ultimately is causing the behavior or the thing that we're observing. Now that we've tested our hypothesis and gotten results, we can move on to the next step, which is drawing conclusions. Now in this step, you can either find that your research supported your initial observations and confirmed your hypothesis, in which means you have fully explained this behavior, or you find that your results have contradicted your hypothesis, which means you would need to go back to the hypothesis forming stage and see where you went wrong and see if you can come up with a new hypothesis, which you would then test to see if you can finally explain that behavior fully. The results of psychological studies don't just come in the form of numbers that we have to try to guess what it means. There are many different ways, which we will touch on in class, that psychologists take the data that they get from experiments and other studies, and they analyze it to provide strong evidence for their hypotheses. This step, drawing conclusions, addresses the third major goal in psychology, which is trying to get a prediction of behavior. After we have drawn conclusions from our research study, we now find that we can predict when this behavior is going to happen. Now that we can reliably predict this behavior, it's time for us to report our results. This is where we come to conclusions about why our experiment or study succeeded or why it failed. Now, this can be in the form of taking a closer look at the method we used to study and coming to the realization that it wasn't a greatly designed study. Or maybe there were other factors influencing the behavior we were trying to observe that we didn't account for. This gives us a chance to take a good look at the scientific process up until this point. And after we have reported our results and get it out into the world, other researchers now have a chance to look at the research we've done and give their input on why we succeeded or why we failed. This is a major part of psychological research. In this step, you'll go into detail the process in which you went to try and test this behavior. This is so that other researchers can try and repeat your study to see if they can get the same results. Psychological studies aren't really taken that seriously if your results can't be replicated. If you can't replicate your results, that means that you did something in your study that didn't really measure what you were trying to measure. However, if your results can be replicated, this means that now that we know what causes this behavior and we can predict it, we can now move on to the fourth goal of psychology, and we can now control this behavior. We can reliably know what leads to it, so we can either promote it or we can keep from passing it on continuously. So these are the major steps in the scientific method which all psychologists have to go to in order to test behavior. All research studies will include statistics, and statistics is the branch of mathematics that is concerned with the collection and interpretation of data samples. Every single psychological study has some aspects of statistics in it. In order to get started in that, we're going to review measures of central tendency. Those being the mean, the median, and the mode. The mean being the arithmetic average, the median, the middle number, and a lined set of numbers, and the mode, or the most frequently occurring number. Starting with the mean, take a second to pause the video and try to figure out what the average of these 8 numbers is. If you did this correctly, you should have come up with 14.5. Adding up these 8 numbers and then dividing that total by 8 should have given you 14.5. The mean is a good way to get a middle number out of a set of data if you don't have an extraordinarily high or an extraordinarily low number. For example, if we take this same set of numbers and change one to 40 instead of what it was, that average jumps up by almost 3 whole numbers. Now, in this small data set, that may not be a big difference, but if you take, for example, a community where most people make the average income, but there are a few millionaires in the area, that average will shoot up a lot. So, to combat that, there are 2 methods that aren't really susceptible to the influence of outliers, extremely high or extremely low numbers. And one of those is the median, or the middle number. So, if you take these numbers and line them up from highest to lowest, this is what you get, and you have to pick the middle value. If you get a distribution like this, where you have an even set of numbers, you go to the 2 middle numbers and you take that average. So for this, the 2 middle numbers are 14 and 15, the average of which is 14 and a half. Now if we go and we change that number and make it very, very high again, we see that if we line them up, the median is unaffected. It's still 14.5, which means that the median isn't very susceptible to the influence of outliers. The next measure of central tendency is the mode, or the most frequently occurring number. In this distribution, the numbers 14 and 15 both occur twice, so they are both the mode in this distribution. When number distributions have 2 equally occurring numbers, they're called bimodal. meaning they have two modes.